The rain fell in relentless sheets, hammering the cracked pavement of the quiet suburban street as if the sky itself were grieving. In the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, a man stood alone, his thin frame swallowed by a tattered coat, his face weathered by years of hardship. Clara, peering through her rain-streaked kitchen window, felt her heart twist at the sight. She didn't know his name, didn't know his story, but she knew the ache of seeing someone abandoned to the cold. It was a fleeting moment, a choice that would change everything. She opened her garage door and let the stranger in for one night, unaware that he carried not just the weight of his past but a secret that would unravel her world. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, or in the quiet miracles that can change a life, please hit that like button, leave a comment, share this story, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. We'd love to have you join our community of compassionate souls. Clara's life had not always been one of open doors. At 42, she lived alone in a modest house on the edge of town, a place filled with echoes of a life she'd once dreamed of. Her days were a rhythm of routine, work at the local library, quiet evenings with a book, and the occasional call from her sister, who lived hours away. But beneath the surface of her orderly existence lay a quiet ache, a longing for connection that she buried under layers of practicality. Her husband, Tom, had left 5 years ago, not for another woman or a grand adventure, but because he said he couldn't breathe in their small, predictable life. The divorce had been civil, but it left Clara with a lingering sense of failure, a belief that she wasn't enough, not for Tom, not for the dreams they'd once shared. She filled her days with small acts of kindness, like leaving extra cookies for the neighbor's kids or slipping a few dollars into the library's donation jar, but these gestures felt like drops in an ocean of loneliness. That night, as the storm raged outside, Clara saw the man under the street lamp, and something stirred within her, a flicker of defiance against the world's indifference, a need to prove that kindness still mattered. The man hesitated at the garage door, his eyes wary, as if he expected a trap. Clara stood in the rain, her cardigan clinging to her shoulders, and gestured for him to come inside. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his late 50s, with graying hair matted against his scalp and a beard that looked more like neglect than intention. His clothes were soaked, the kind of wet that seeps into your bones, and he carried a small, battered backpack that seemed to hold everything he owned. Clara didn't ask questions, she simply pointed to the corner of the garage where she'd set up a folding cot with a blanket and a pillow. The man nodded, his voice rough as he muttered a thank you, and Clara closed the door, leaving him to the quiet hum of the storm outside. She lay awake that night, listening to the rain, her mind racing with doubts. Had she been reckless? Was she naive to trust a stranger? But there was something else, too, a warmth in her chest, a sense that she'd done something right, even if it was small. Morning came with a pale, watery light filtering through the clouds. Clara rose early, her breath catching as she approached the garage, half expecting to find it empty or, worse, ransacked. But the man was still there, sitting on the cot, his backpack clutched to his chest. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time, she saw his eyes clearly, deep blue, like a sky after a storm, and filled with a quiet intensity that unsettled her. He introduced himself as Henry, his voice steady but soft, as if he hadn't spoken his own name in years. Clara offered him coffee and a plate of toast, which he accepted with a gratitude that felt almost ceremonial. Over the next hour, as the rain slowed to a drizzle, Henry spoke in fragments about his life, not a full story, but pieces that hinted at loss, a business that failed, a family scattered, a home lost to debts he couldn't pay. Clara listened, her librarian's instinct for stories kicking in, piecing together the gaps he left unspoken. She didn't press him for details, but she felt the weight of his words, the way they carried years of regret and resilience. The day unfolded slowly, with Clara torn between her routine and the stranger in her garage. She had work at the library, but she called in sick, something she hadn't done in years. Instead, she found herself drawn back to Henry, bringing him a second cup of coffee, then a sandwich, each small act pulling her deeper into his orbit. He didn't ask to stay another night, but Clara offered, her voice firm despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. She told herself it was just for one more night, just until the storm passed, but there was something about Henry's presence, his quiet dignity, his refusal to complain, that made her want to help him more. That evening, as they sat in the garage with the door open to the cooling air, Henry pulled a small, worn notebook from his backpack. He flipped through it, his fingers trembling slightly, and showed her a page filled with sketches, intricate drawings of buildings, bridges, and cityscapes, each one alive with detail. He said he'd been an architect once, before everything fell apart. Clara stared at the sketches, her heart aching at the beauty of what he'd lost, and she wondered how someone with such talent could end up alone on the street. Over the next few days, Clara's life began to shift in ways she hadn't expected. Henry stayed in the garage, and though she told herself it was temporary, she found herself looking forward to their conversations. He spoke of his past sparingly, but each story revealed a man who had once built things, homes, dreams, a life, and lost them to a series of cruel twists, a business partner's betrayal, a market crash, a daughter who stopped calling. Clara shared her own struggles, haltingly at first, about Tom's departure, about the quiet loneliness of her days. There was no judgment in Henry's eyes, only understanding, and it made Clara feel seen in a way she hadn't in years. But the arrangement wasn't without challenges. Neighbors began to notice the stranger coming and going from her garage, their whispers sharp with suspicion. Clara overheard Mrs. Larson, the neighborhood gossip, muttering about vagrants and safety risks, and it stung. She began to doubt herself, wondering if she was being foolish, if kindness was a luxury she couldn't afford. At night, she lay awake, wrestling with the fear that she was opening her life to chaos, that Henry might disappear or, worse, betray her trust. Yet something kept her from asking Henry to leave. It was the way he helped without being asked, fixing a loose shelf in the garage, sweeping the floor, or leaving small sketches on scraps of paper as quiet tokens of gratitude. One morning, Clara found a drawing of her house tucked under her coffee mug, the lines so precise and loving that it brought tears to her eyes. She began to see Henry not as a homeless man but as a person with a past as rich and complex as her own, someone who had fallen but was still reaching for something better. She started bringing him books from the library, architecture journals, novels, anything to spark the light she saw in his eyes when he talked about design. In return, Henry shared more of his story, revealing glimpses of a man who had once owned a successful firm, who had traveled the world, who had a daughter named Lily he hadn't seen in a decade. The more Clara learned, the more she felt a responsibility, not just to shelter him but to help him find his way back to the man he used to be. The turning point came a week later, on a crisp morning when Clara found Henry gone. The cot was neatly made, the blanket folded, but his backpack was missing, and so was he. A note lay on the cot, written in his careful hand, "Thank you, Clara, for giving me more than a roof. I'll never forget your kindness." Her heart sank, a mix of relief and loss swelling inside her. She told herself it was for the best, that she'd done what she could, but the emptiness of the garage echoed the loneliness she'd fought so hard to keep at bay. Days passed, then weeks, and Clara tried to return to her routine, but the house felt quieter, the world smaller. She kept Henry's sketches, tucking them into a drawer, and wondered where he'd gone, if he was safe, if she'd made a difference at all. The neighbors' whispers faded, but so did the spark of purpose she'd felt with Henry there. She began to question whether kindness was worth the cost, whether opening her heart had been a mistake. Then, one chilly afternoon, a letter arrived. It was postmarked from a city Clara had never visited, and the handwriting was unmistakable. Inside was a check for $10,000, made out to her, and a letter from Henry. He wrote that her kindness had given him the courage to reach out to an old colleague, who had offered him a job at a small architecture firm. The check, he explained, was a fraction of what he owed her, not in money, but in gratitude. Clara's hands trembled as she read on, learning that Henry wasn't just an architect but a man who had once been a millionaire, his wealth lost to bad investments and betrayal. He'd been too ashamed to reclaim his life until Clara's act of trust reminded him that he was still worthy of second chances. The letter ended with a promise. He was searching for his daughter, Lily, and hoped to rebuild what he'd lost. Clara sat at her kitchen table, tears streaming down her face, the check forgotten as she realized the true wealth of what she'd given and received. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet joy. Clara used the money to start a small community fund at the library, helping others in need with books, job resources, and a warm place to sit. She kept in touch with Henry, who sent occasional letters about his new life, his tentative steps toward reconnecting with Lily. Clara's own life began to shift, too. She joined a book club, started painting again, and found herself smiling more. The neighbors' suspicion faded, replaced by curiosity about the woman who had dared to trust a stranger. Clara's story spread, not because she sought attention, but because kindness has a way of rippling outward, touching lives she'd never know. She realized that opening her garage door had opened her heart, not just to Henry but to the possibility of a life less lonely, less afraid. Her small act had built a bridge, not just for Henry, but for herself, to a future where she could believe in second chances, too. As Clara stood in her garage one evening, looking at the cot where Henry had slept, she felt a profound gratitude, for the storm that brought him, for the courage to act, for the reminder that even in a world of closed doors, one open heart can change everything. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of the power of kindness or the beauty of second chances, please like, comment, and share this video. Subscribe to Kindness Speaks, and let's keep spreading stories that inspire and uplift. And before we end, I have a special request. In the comments below, share a moment when kindness changed your life or someone else's. It could be your story, or one you've witnessed. Your words might inspire someone else to open the door, just like Clara did.